Welcome back to the channel. This is Trendy Storm and you are watching What If Naruto Was Sealed by Juubi for 1,000 years. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share and subscribe to this channel. Now wasting no more time, let's start the story.
Using his orange shirt underneath, he gave himself some breathing room by pulling up the zip of his black and orange jacket. The right leg ended halfway down his thigh, with a red spiral embroidered on the front, while the left leg appeared to have been cut off above the knee in his black trousers, revealing a white bandage peeking out underneath. His jacket and his bulky boots matched. His blue eyes scanned the 3 whisker marks on each cheek that gave him an animal-like appearance, and he ruffled his blonde hair to make sure it was spiky as he took one last look in the mirror, feeling content with his appearance. He reached into his pocket, took out an old, crumpled photo, glanced at it, put it back, and left. His fans surrounded him as soon as he left his tiny apartment, yelling, cheering, and yelling his name. Everyone wants to be able to claim to have seen the star player Naruto turn to face the throng of people obstructing his path, each one yelling his name. A young child sitting on his father's shoulders held out a blue and white ball and asked, "Can you sign this?" As he pulled a pen from his pocket and caught the thrown ball, the blonde smiled and said, "Sure thing." He signed the ball quickly and then gave it back to the child, who immediately leapt off his father's shoulders and ran off to find his friends. He was grinning broadly and holding the ball high above his head. When the crowd saw what he had done, they pushed forward with t-shirts, notebooks, balls, and anything else they could find to have him sign. He complied gladly. "You going to the game?" he asked 2 girls while signing a ball for them. The tall blonde answered, "Of course, we never miss any of your games." "Great," he said, laughing as he returned the ball with his right arm extended in front of him and his fist in the air. He said, "Well, when I score a goal I'll do this as. That'll mean it's for you." The girls squealed with delight. "Really? Believe it? Whereabouts you sitting?" asked the man. The girls swooned when they heard, "East block 3rd row, 2nd on the right." After giving a wink, Naruto walked back through the throng of people. "'Kay then, I'll see you there then." Naruto spent the next half hour interacting with his fans, posing for pictures and signing autographs, until he eventually looked up to see the time displayed on a clock tower. When he looked around, he saw that he had only been a few feet from his apartment because he had spent so much time with the people in the crowd. He hurriedly returned the notebook he had been signing and began to push his way through the crowd to reach the stadium, but was stopped when a group of 3 children blocked his path. "Wow, hey guys, I need to get going," he exclaimed. As the other 2 gentlemen expressed their agreement, the young boy at the front of the group asked, "Hey boss, can you teach us how to play blitzball?" His long blue scarf fluttered in the wind. Naruto groaned and gripped his head in exasperation when the kids didn't move, saying, "Aw come on guys, you're going to make me late for the big game." He said, "How about tonight after the game?" He heard someone say, "You can't tonight." However, he couldn't tell who it was because of the sea of people pushing and pulling against one another. After giving it some thought, he looked at the 3 of them and said, "I know, how about tomorrow?" Even though he didn't know who said it, it caused him to reconsider his plan to celebrate tonight if they prevailed in the match. The girl in the group blushed, and her blush only got worse when he said he would, and she asked, "You promise?" The 3 children nodded in agreement, then abruptly stood up, bowed their heads, and held their right hand in front of their faces with the middle and index fingers pointing up. They looked up in time to see the blonde dash through the crowd and vanish, and the girl asked, "Are you sure he'll teach us?" The boy with the scarf put his arm around his 2 friends' shoulders and laughed. "Of course, after all, he promised and he never breaks his promises." Naruto observed the sights as he ran through Konoha's streets. People were moving between stores, bars, and restaurants while loud music was playing. Youngsters were laughing, singing, and playing games with their friends while running through the streets. Some were kicking balls around as if they were participating in the major game that would be played later that evening. Naruto emerged from the high street into the expansive park of Konoha, which was teeming with hundreds of flowers and trees. More kids were playing as squirrels darted about along the meandering path through the trees. Naruto halted and turned around when he noticed a squirrel staring at him. In an attempt to make sense of the unfamiliar person it was seeing, the animal cocked its head at the blonde. Unaware of the reason, Naruto followed suit when the squirrel was joined by a second and approached closely for a closer look. However, he stepped on a twig, startling the animals, who fled to the safety of their tree. He continued to enjoy the sights around him while laughing to himself when someone with a microphone stepped onto the stage. He finally arrived at a clearing with a sizable stage and screen set up. Hundreds of people gathered in front of it. As the crowd became restless, the announcer said, "I was just a kid who'd run away from home when I heard the news. Minato, the greatest blitzball player there ever was missing. Well, I just ran straight back home and back to my dad. He must have been the biggest Minato fan there, and we must have spent the whole night just talking about him. It's the closest I think I ever was to him." His eyes were distant. "Oh, sorry about that everyone, got a little nostalgic there, didn't I?" He chuckled. The park erupted in cheers as soon as his name was mentioned. "Well, that was more than 10 years ago, and now we're here for the 9th annual Minato Memorial Cup. The finalists in today's match are the Leaf Blades and the Konoha Spirals, along with their star player and Minato's own son Naruto." As the crowd became more and more boisterous, the host began to bounce up and down, asking, "Will we see his father's legendary shot? The kid looks like his father, plays like his father, and I'm sure he's just like his father outside the sphere as well." The announcer continued to talk, but Naruto ignored it and continued on his way, becoming disinterested in what was being said as soon as it was revealed that he was related to Minato. Minato may have been a hero to the people of Konoha, but to him, he was just a man who had abandoned his family. He tried to ignore this, though, because he had plenty of time to reflect on it later. However, he was so absorbed in his thoughts that he failed to notice the big man he ran into in the back. Naruto looked up at the tall man and said, "Oh, sorry." The man turned to face him, frowning and bringing his fist back. The man's eyes were burning through Naruto when he said, "Yeah, I'll make sure you're sorry." However, before anything could happen, they softened when he realized who had bumped into him. He laughed. "Oh no, I'm sorry." He waved at a group of people at the side of the road and said, "Oi everyone, look, it's Naruto." They hurried over. However, the little group soon started to get bigger and bigger until there were people occupying the entire courtyard outside the stadium. People who came to watch his son play, remember the great Minato, and witness the season's biggest game. Naruto smiled as he started to slowly push his way through the sea of people that surrounded him. Eventually, he made it to the stadium's entrance, which was flanked by 2 enormous statues. He took one final glance behind him as he ascended the rampway, taking in the clear blue night sky above and the jubilant fans being restrained by the security. Even though it was odd, he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same after the game. His smile faltered a little as he gestured to the audience before turning around and heading into the locker room. When Naruto scored the first goal, the stadium was crowded to capacity, with people sitting on the roofs and standing in the aisles. He raised his fist to the crowd in the east stand, causing 2 of the girls seated there to scream more loudly. He turned around and hurriedly returned to the game, which had already restarted, grinning to himself. As the 2 teams battled for control of the ball inside the water sphere that appeared to float in front of them, above the ground, almost magically, the crowd erupted in cheers. The 10 men frantically swam around inside the sphere, trying to catch the ball that was constantly being traded between the 2 teams. At one point, 2 members of the Swirls gave a Leaf Blades player such a hard tackle that he broke out of the sphere and flew across the stadium, landing on top of some 4th-row fans. After giving each other a high five and assessing the damage they had caused, the Swirl players swam away while the sphere fixed itself, sealing the hole and halting the water leak. A lone figure stood atop a building near the stadium, gazing over the city as the game continued. He wore a thick black belt around his waist that matched his pants, and his tall, spiky white hair defied gravity as the bottom of his red haori blew in the breeze. He had a black mask over his mouth, a patch over his left eye, and a thin scar that ran down his cheek and under it. The sound of music rose from the streets below, where people were singing and drinking, and his single black eye peered over the city, illuminated by the lights and enormous monitors that were broadcasting the blitzball match. On one side of the city, where the land and the sea met, fireworks were lit up into the clear night sky by the ships that were in port. They then turned their gaze away from the sea and toward the opposite side of the city, where the Cage Mountains, adorned with the faces of Konoha's greatest citizens, towered over even the biggest structure. A large number were former leaders or powerful individuals. Nevertheless, Minato's face stood out the most, grinning across the city he cherished as a huge shadow hung over the mountains. The man held up a canteen, silently toasted Minato, then lowered his mask and took a long drink. The match was coming to a head back down in the stadium. The score was tied at 1 goal each with just 1 minute remaining. With each man trying to score the game-winning goal, both teams engaged in a fierce battle for the ball that became rougher and rougher as the seconds passed. Naruto, the star player for the Swirls, struggled valiantly to rejoin the game at the far end of the sphere, but 2 leaf blades kept getting in his way. A leaf blade rushed for the goal as the Swirls' defense was suddenly breached. The player swiftly kicked the ball 20 feet from the goal, sending it sailing past a Swirl that was attempting to intercept it and directly at the goalie. The goalkeeper jumped across the goal and deflected the ball back across the sphere after catching it with the tips of his fingers. A cloud of smoke appeared around the ball as it floated through the water, and Naruto held the ball in his hand as it vanished. The first Naruto broke past the two players who had been obstructing him and swam to the top of the sphere, lowering their defenses as they glanced between the two identical individuals. Just as he was being tackled, the second Naruto kicked the ball to the center of the sphere, but instead of falling through the water, he vanished in a cloud of smoke, leaving his opponent perplexed. Another Naruto emerged in a cloud of smoke as the ball approached the center of the sphere, kicked it upward, and then vanished in the same manner just as the final surviving Naruto reached the top of the sphere. The ball broke the surface as it flew through the water as the last few seconds on the clock dwindled. The entire audience erupted in cheers as the blonde emerged from the water and stood ready to make the game's last shot. However, he was distracted by something before he could fire. His eyes widened in shock and surprise as he looked over the stadium roof and across the city and saw a huge creature towering over the city suddenly fire multiple blasts of energy that flew across the skyline before striking multiple buildings and causing massive explosions. The stadium stand behind Naruto was struck by a blast that flew past him, sending debris flying in the water sphere below him, dispersing and falling to the ground with him like a torrential downpour in a desperate attempt to save his life. He frantically grabbed onto a beam protruding from the stadium's side as he began to fall. However, he lost his hold and fell to the ground, screaming in fear as the stadium shook from another blast. Drops of water struck Naruto's cheek as he slowly regained consciousness, his head spinning when he opened his eyes. All he saw were blurs speeding by and muffled noises that seemed to come from everywhere. He stood up slowly, closed his eyes, and slapped his face with his icy, wet hands before opening them again and gaining a better understanding of his surroundings. The stadium where he had been playing had collapsed around them, and the blurs and muffled sounds were people running and screaming around him in fear and panic. When he looked up to see where he had fallen, he discovered that the roof he had been clinging to was gone. He began to walk, following the crowds of people out of the stadium, grateful that he had landed in a pool of water rather than the cold, hard floor, which had cushioned his landing. He was knocked about as people bumped into him, only concerned with their personal safety, and he followed the crowds past smashed shop fronts and fallen walls. His attention was suddenly drawn to something: a small child, covered in glass, huddled at the path's edge under a broken window. He walked over and shook the person, worried that they were hurt. "Hey, you okay, kid?" No response. He started to say, "Hey kid, you," but stopped when he turned the child over. The young girl had pleaded with him and her friends earlier that day to teach them how to play blitzball. Several deep cuts from the broken glass replaced the constant flush that usually adorned her face. "No, no, 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 no," he exclaimed in a panic. "Someone, please help," he yelled, but no one responded as he attempted to revive the child because they were too focused on themselves to assist others. He reluctantly gave up trying to revive the girl after several minutes of fruitless attempts. With his hands covered in her blood and feeling helpless, he looked around and saw that the girl wasn't the only one who had been harmed, because there were bodies scattered all over the floor. Others who weren't running away in terror were rifling through the stadium's stores and stalls, while a few people had gathered around the bodies. A steady voice behind the blonde said, "At times like these, the true nature of a person is shown." He turned around and discovered the voice's owner, a man with long hair and a red outfit. As the man got closer, Naruto yelled, "Kakashi." He simply waved this hand at the boy and said, "Yo." The blonde began to head to check on another body after saying, "Kakashi, we have to do something. We have to help these people." However, he was stopped when a hand grabbed his shoulder, causing him to turn around and stare into Kakashi's lone eye. As the stadium trembled, he said in an emotionless voice, "There's nothing we can do for them. They're already dead." He turned and walked slowly towards the entrance, leaving Naruto alone once more. "We're better off leaving here before any more of this place falls on top of us," he silently prayed as he gazed down at the girl's still body on the ground. After he was done, he opened his eyes, inhaled deeply, and then turned to pursue Kakashi while yelling at him to wait. As people hurried about in the chaos, Naruto ran between the statues at the stadium's entrance. He cried out, "Kakashi! Kakashi!" His voice was drowned out by the panicked cries of the crowd as he searched in vain for the red-clad man. He called out again, "Kakashi, where'd you go?" As someone from behind knocked him to the ground as he stood up, he anticipated seeing the back of the person who had shoved him down. Fleeing instead, he noticed that everyone around him was silently standing motionless. He slipped past the man next to him, staring at him as if he were motionless, and he waved his hand in front of his face without responding. Over the silence, a single voice yelled, "It begins." Naruto spun around on his heels, confronting a boy who had not been there just moments before. "What?" the bewildered blonde asked the boy wearing a pale green jacket and a somewhat familiar blue scarf around his neck. However, the boy turned around and left him without responding. He immediately tried to stop the child from leaving by placing his foot on the end of the scarf that trailed along the floor, but he passed right through it. He was certain that the child had something to do with the strange events that were taking place. "What's going on? What are you?" Before Naruto was blinded by a white flash of light, the child said, "Don't cry." When his vision returned, everyone was running and screaming around him as if nothing had ever happened. He tried to make sense of what had happened and looked around, even more perplexed than before. Perhaps he had a concussion if he had been seeing things, or had a head injury from his fall before he could consider those options. However, he saw the top of Kakashi's head emerge from the crowd and immediately followed him. As the sounds of explosions reverberated around them, Naruto decided not to discuss what had just transpired because he knew how absurd it would sound. He followed the one-eyed man through the crowds in silence before they spoke. They went through the streets, past buildings that had collapsed, through glass that had shattered, through prone bodies that had been lying on the ground for a few minutes. Naruto questioned, "Kakashi, what's happening?" before swerving to avoid falling debris. "Where are we going?" Kakashi merely pointed ahead of them and said, "There." Naruto was frightened by what he saw. A gigantic black creature with 10 long tails swaying in the night sky was standing enormously above the city's tallest buildings. The city and the devastation it was causing were being watched over by its enormous single red eye. What the hell is that thing?" As the ground shook from another blast, Kakashi said unfazed, "We called it Juubi of Sin." When Naruto looked up from behind his arms shielding his face from the blast, he asked again, "Juubi of Sin?" and saw Kakashi still moving forward before pursuing the man once more. He yelled, "Hey, come on, wait up." At last, they began to move toward the large bridge that spanned the river that divided the city in two. As they crossed, Naruto glanced down at the ground below and saw smoke rising from the wreckage of the buildings he used to visit, and people in the streets darting about like insects in search of a safe place to hide. As music played that was far more appropriate for the party atmosphere from earlier in the day than the carnage that was now occurring, a monitor covering the side of one of the few tall buildings that were still standing along the riverside displayed a picture of Minato grinning. "For what reason are you laughing?" As the image of his father flickered on the screen, Naruto thought to himself. It almost seemed like he was enjoying the destruction. As a small group of people ran past them in the opposite direction, he called to Kakashi, who was also staring at the picture of his father, asking, "Why are we heading this way?" His response, without turning to face the young man, was, "We're expected." He questioned, "Expected? What you mean expected?" but never received a response as the bridge was rocked by an explosion and the once clear road was suddenly populated with odd animals. Each creature had a long, dark body with 4 legs, wings that appeared to flicker a light blue, and pincers. He took a few steps back and questioned, "What are these things, giant cockroaches?" As he was being moved slowly forward feeling more assured, he kicked the next attacker, catching it in the head and knocking it to the side of the road after he threw a punch that made them retreat as they got closer. However, as soon as it struck the ground, another one replaced it, lunging at him and sending him to his backside in order to escape. "Here!" Kakashi yelled, throwing a tiny pouch at him before snagging one of the charging animals by the pincers and hurling it off the bridge's side and into the roaring river. Naruto opened the pouch to discover multiple 3-pronged knives inside. "Hey, aren't?" As he produced his own single blade and cut through the body of another creature, Kakashi interrupted, saying, "Those kunai are a gift from Minato." He turned one of the blades in his hand and looked at it, asking, "My old man?" He recalled his mother mentioning how his father used to practice with these weapons, claiming it helped him become more proficient at blitzball. He believed he had one of the kunai at home, resting on the mantelpiece, but all of a sudden he found himself holding 8 of them. Regaining his footing, he fastened the pouch to his belt, grasped the blade in reverse, and readied himself for the subsequent assault. As the city's lights reflected off the knife, a group of creatures gazed at him, seemingly trying to figure out what he was holding before one of them finally chose to hurry him. When it leapt at him, he swiftly struck it with his fist like a hammer, piercing it in the head between its eyes, causing it to scream in agony before collapsing and ceasing to move. He freed the blade and charged the rest of the group, swerving and avoiding their blows while launching his own. As he approached the blonde who killed the last of his creatures by chopping off its head, Kakashi said, "Not bad." He had left a pile of dead creatures he had created by the side of the road. "I told you all that blitzball practice would help you if you ever got into a fight." In an attempt to see a reaction on Kakashi's face, Naruto jokingly said, "Yay, but this isn't the kind of fight you were talking about though, was it?" The man appeared to smile back at him with one eye before abruptly pushing him aside as another creature lunged at them from behind. He realized that the creatures were now encircling them on both sides of the bridge, flapping their wings as if they were thrilled about the possibility of killing the 2 of them, and he yelled, "Now what?" more, for the entire Konoha to hear. As he and Naruto stood back to back, ready to attack, Kakashi murmured from beneath his mask. This could be a problem. As the two battled their foes, they watched for any opportunity to get away, but each time one creature died, another would appear to fill the void before they could get away. Before he could kick it away, one unexpectedly broke through Naruto's defenses and cut his arm with one of its pincers. He turned to Kakashi while clutching his arm and making a painful grimace. This isn't working, we're going to get killed. As he reached into his pocket and took out a tag, he wrapped it around the handle of his kunai and said, "Agreed. When I say run, run, got it." He threw the kunai off the side of the bridge and into the nearby building before Naruto could question what he was going to do. It began to tilt in the direction of the bridge after the blade abruptly exploded as soon as it struck the building's side, causing it to shake. He was so shocked by what was happening that he didn't see Kakashi shouting to run as he took off as quickly as he could, or throwing a second blade, which would have caused another explosion and cleared the bridge in their direction before realizing he was going to die if he didn't run. He just stood there while the building bearing his father's image began to collapse on top of him. He was just in time to see it fall onto the bridge, and as he ran, the impact caused it to buckle beneath his feet. He tried to move faster and faster in an attempt to stay ahead of the collapsing bridge before the area he was standing on collapsed and he had to jump. As the bridge collapsed beneath him, he sailed across it, windmilling his arms in an attempt to reach the other end, which was now the only portion of the bridge still intact. Clinging to the edge for dear life, he eventually made it to the other side and slowly pulled himself back up. For a brief moment, he lay there desperately trying to regain his breath after managing to drag his chest up onto the side, but when the bridge trembled once more, the edge he was standing on collapsed under him, and he had to use his hands to hold on for dear life. Once more someone was standing above him when he slipped while attempting to get back up, leaving him hanging by one hand. If a hand hadn't reached out and grabbed Naruto by the collar as he finally lost his hold, he would have fallen. Naruto was relieved to see it was Kakashi, and he was lifted up so they could look at each other. However, instead of lowering him back down on the bridge's remnants, he was held up before he could wonder what was happening. He looked up and saw that the Juubi of Sin had appeared above them, seemingly observing them. "Are you sure?" Kakashi asked, but Naruto realized he wasn't speaking to him at all. Instead, he was addressing the creature above them, which appeared to nod its head in agreement before opening its mouth to let a jet black sphere form inside of it. This is it. As the sphere that had been accumulating in the Juubi's mouth was released and fell upon them, Naruto turned to face the man who had been holding him hanging over the edge. The noise of the Juubi attempted to muffle his voice. Before everything went dark, all he could hear was, "This is your story, it all begins here." Determined to wake him, the rain poured down and splashed against his face. However, all he did as it fell was lie on the ground with his feet hanging in the surrounding water. At last, he opened his eyes as thunder roared in the sky above. He sat up, looked around, and discovered that the only scenery he had was the submerged, broken ruins that surrounded him while he lay on a small stone platform, just above the water. As a flash of lightning illuminated the night sky, he dragged himself to his feet and stood up in the hopes of gaining a better view. As if expecting a response, he asked himself out loud, "Where am I?" He attempted to recall what had transpired. He recalled the boisterous music, enthusiastic spectators, and a fierce game of blitzball. However, after giving it some more thought, he recalled the odd creature that had attacked his house. Upon further reflection, he realized that the last thing he remembered was staring up at the weird creature as it attacked Kakashi and him. When he realized he was alone and the spiky-haired mane was nowhere to be seen, he thought, "Kakashi." He shouted across the water, "Kakashi," but got no response. He called out again in the hopes that someone would hear, but once more there was no response. "Hello," he called out. "Hey," once more, this time with pain in his throat, and this time a crow responded by perching on the rocks next to him. The crow just stared at him blankly before taking off again into the horizon, startled by another lightning strike, and he laughed to himself, "Just the two of us then." Examining himself, he discovered that he was only slightly bruised and scratched, despite his fall in the stadium, his battles with the weird creatures, and whatever else had led him to this strange place of submerged ruins. His left arm cut from the fight was the only exception. He untied the bandage he had on his left leg and wrapped it tightly around the wound after realizing it was no longer bleeding. Throughout his blitzball career, he had sustained multiple injuries, but he wasn't too worried about them. He would simply have a doctor suture him if he could locate a physician. After another lightning strike, he decided it would be best to escape the storm that was beginning to rage overhead. He dove back into the water and swam between the ruins, which resembled islands in the sea, searching for any kind of cover. As he swam around, he noticed a large courtyard below where a number of large statues were submerged. At the edge of the pool, he discovered some large stone steps that rose out of the water and led to the only building in the area that was still standing in addition to being overgrown with vegetation. The walls were in poor condition due to years of weather-related damage. He slowly pushed the heavy, creaking door open with all of his weight, and as soon as the opening was wide enough, he scampered inside and pushed the door shut. He finally slid down against the door as it closed, leaning against the hard, cold stone and taking deep breaths. Looking around him as he sat there, he discovered that he was in a lengthy hallway. He got back up and walked slowly to the far end, where he examined everything on the walls. The corridor was lined with dried-up dead flowers and paintings. Many of the paintings had fallen to the floor, while others were still hanging on the walls. The rain that had seeped through the crevices destroyed some, and dust covered others. He was curious about the paintings, so he cleaned one and discovered it had faded, making it impossible to identify what it had been before time took its toll. Upon reaching the end, he pushed the door open and entered a spacious room. Old and damaged furniture and the fragments of several statues that had fallen and were lying on the ground or against the walls were scattered throughout the exterior. When he looked up, he saw a balcony running around the outside edge above him, with stone gargoyles watching him as water that had somehow gotten inside spilled off one ledge in a waterfall-like fashion. The remnants of an old, burned-out fire pit, covered in dust from years of neglect, were also located in the center of the space. Naruto immediately started a fresh fire to warm himself and dry his still wet clothes after realizing how cold he was. He moved to one side of the room, picked up a chair that was on the floor, and then swung it against the floor, shattering it into pieces. He gathered the pieces, tossed them into the fire pit, then took one and rolled it between two hands in the hopes that the friction would ignite the fire. However, he gave up after 10 minutes. And the only thing he had managed to do was rub his hands raw. He started looking around the room for something to light a fire and something to eat as his stomach growled with hunger, but he was unsuccessful. Unwilling to give up, he discovered a door blocked by debris, dropped from the ceiling, and began excavating to gain entry. But as soon as it was nearly obvious, he had to leap back, and the door, which had been supported by the debris, collapsed and fell over. He entered the room cautiously through the broken stone and discovered that the floor was wet, with water seeping through crevices and an open window in the far wall and the ripped curtains flapping in the breeze. With the rain splattering against his face, Naruto looked out the window. The night sky had grown darker, making the entire area completely dark. Only the boundless sea was visible when the lightning finally illuminated the sky. He kept looking, remembering he had more important things to do. Without success, he searched the rubble-covered floor and rummaged through the shelves holding ancient books and scrolls. The blonde was about to leave after finally giving up his search when he noticed something. The remnants of a desk, whose legs had buckled under the weight that had fallen on top of it, were concealed beneath the door that had fallen. He opened the desk's protruding drawer and rummaged through it, discovering more papers and writing instruments before discovering a set of flintstones concealed in the back corner. He joyfully grabbed them and hurried back into the main chamber, pounding the stones together until he finally got a spark and ignited his little fire. As the sounds of the storm outside continued to rage, he collapsed in front of the fire, allowing it to warm him as the flames danced around, lighting the area. His stomach rumbled once more, trying to remind him that he was still hungry, but he was thinking about his predicament and didn't care. In what location was he? How did he arrive? And the more he considered it, the more he wished someone, anyone, could be by his side. Thus, he no longer had to be by himself. Then he passed out, finally succumbing to exhaustion. Naruto asked, "What do you want?" as Kakashi entered his apartment without knocking. Before he spoke, the man stood there for a few minutes, staring at the teenager who was slumped in his chair. "It was a bad call. Your team lost because of you." Naruto jumped out of his seat and yelled, "You came to say that?" Even though he was aware that he was to blame for his team's defeat, he didn't want anyone else to point that out to him. Did they want it to make him feel worse? The blonde, still irritated, eventually sat back down, but the man seemed unconcerned, going into the kitchen to make himself a drink before coming back and sitting on the sofa before continuing. Kakashi drank slowly and for a long time. "It's been 10 years. Naruto gave the man a startled look. In return, all day long, no one had discussed it with him, and it hurt to think about it. After taking another sip, he added, "I thought you'd be crying." He then looked around the table, where there were empty ramen cuts, to find a spot to set his tea. He turned away from the one-eyed man and hoped that the conversation would end. "Who, me? Crying for little kids?" A third voice murmured, "You cried?" Naruto quickly glanced around to find the speaker. With a yawn, Naruto awoke and attempted to recall the bizarre dream he had experienced. However, the more he considered it, the more difficult it was for him to recall before he gave up. He huddled himself, tucking his knees into his chest as he shivered on the hard, cold floor. Why is it so chilly? As he surveyed the room and felt his breath catch in the chilly air, he asked himself. He soon discovered the cause: the embers of the fire that had warmed him before he went to sleep had extinguished, leaving the room dark and only faintly glowing. He jumped up and ran to get more fuel to keep the fire going, but as he returned to the room with his arms full of old books, a roar reverberated throughout the structure. He initially started feeding the fire without giving it any thought, assuming the noise was simply the result of the storm outside. However, Naruto believed he saw movement above him. When he heard the noise again, he heard heavy footsteps and saw a shadow move as he looked around the balconies above him. A creature roared out of the darkness and jumped off the balcony, landing so hard on the ground that Naruto went to his knees. He was confronted by a massive humanoid creature with gray skin and brown hair covering its arms and legs. As he looked back up, with its big, muscular legs stomping heavily on the ground, the creature stepped towards the small man in front of it. After glancing at him, Naruto scrambled to his feet and jumped out of the way as the creature dropped its massive fist, leaving only a dent where he had been standing. He retrieved a kunai from his back pouch and hastily searched for a way out. He walked slowly around the room, hoping to get past the creature and out the door without having to fight it, since that was the only way out he knew. However, the creature suddenly charged directly at him. As he approached the door, it leapt out of the way once more and collided with one of the room's tall columns. The balcony above started to collapse after the support column was removed, and it eventually collapsed on top of the creature. Naruto approached the debris slowly, prepared to respond if the beast had withstood the crushing weight. He jumped back, expecting it to lash out, and kicked at its arm that was protruding from the debris once he was close enough. However, it didn't. He let out a sigh of relief, lowered his defenses, and began moving the debris away from the door. However, he heard a growl as he began to remove some of the smaller rocks, and before he could react, the once dead arm leapt up and grabbed him by the neck. The creature slowly emerged from under the debris as he gasped for air and held Naruto in front of it, seemingly staring him in the eye. Its grip tightened, determined to crush the blonde, and it snarled at him as black blood poured from a cut on its head. Naruto found his kunai again and repeatedly stabbed it into the Orja's hand while kicking his legs due to oxygen deprivation. It roared back and threw Naruto across the room, landing him hard on his back on top of a table that shattered as it hit him. He struggled to catch his breath and dragged himself back to his feet, but he was forced to quickly dodge the charging creature once more while slashing out with his blade, catching it in the back of its leg. This time, Hobbling charged again, but it was much slower and easier for the blonde to avoid, so she hit it again in the back. As it passed, it sent Naruto reeling away as it swung its arm back in agony. The blonde had no choice but to avoid the Orja's pounding fists as it immediately began swinging them wildly in an attempt to crush her. Naruto finally separated the two by making a cross with his middle and index fingers in front of him. He yelled, "Kage Bunshin no Jutsu." Suddenly, 3 more copies of himself materialized in a cloud of smoke next to him. As the other 3 applauded in agreement, the original exclaimed, "Let's get him." They then surrounded the monster, who was momentarily bewildered by its opponent's ability to multiply. The monster, stuck in the center, would hit one Naruto, who would dodge it, while the others attacked with its back to them, gradually wearing it down. A loud explosion reverberated through the hallways, sending loose debris tumbling from the ceiling as the creature slowed down and the Narutos regrouped, prepared to finish it off. Panicked, the 4 blondes scanned their surroundings to see what was going on. However, the creature displayed no concern and exploited the blonde's distraction by striking one in the head with its enormous fist, which quickly vanished in puffs of smoke. One of the Narutos, startled by the abrupt drop in their numbers, rushed forward, leaping into the air with its weapon raised with the intention of bringing it down between the creature's eyes. The door to the exit was blown off its hinges and flew across the room, striking the monster and Naruto clone, who vanished like the first explosion. But another one stopped that. The real Naruto turned to face the doorway as 4 people hurried into the room as the monster roared in rage and picked itself up from beneath the door. All of them wore goggles over their eyes and were dressed in either thick, heavy leather clothing or filthy, stained overalls. The twin blondes asked the group, "Great timing, you here to help?" But all he received in return was 4 guns aimed at him. Aiming his rifle between the 2 Narutos and the monster, one yelled, "Fiends! Druka dfuyna teki cat yc risihc." As he pointed at his head and fired, Naruto heard another call in a foreign language, "Gem dra csymmmuhac vengt. Dra falyh diga dra pek uha." The bullet missed them both and struck the Orj in the shoulder as the Narutos dove for cover, but as soon as the gun barrel was aimed at his head once more, the relief he had gained from escaping the attack was gone. As someone ran past the group and knocked the gun upwards just as another shot was fired, causing the bullet to strike the ceiling, a high-pitched voice called out, "Fide, Frid Ev Ed Ec Risai?" The stranger, wearing a red and tan wetsuit, moved forward to stand next to Naruto and assumed a battle stance, but the man didn't appear impressed. He cheered at the idea of the help he was receiving, but he became alarmed when the stranger, who had dark brown hair tied in a ponytail, charged directly at the monster. "You're helping? Great." Instead of being swatted away, though, he leapt over the creature and kicked it quickly, landing it in the back of the head. He turned on his heels as it staggered forward and, in spite of his tight suit, swiftly engaged it once more, punching it with lightning-fast speed. The two Narutos jumped in, swerving in and out with the stranger as they fought back, attacking from three sides, while the monster crossed its enormous arms in front of its body to deflect some of the blows. At last, it faltered, and Naruto saw the moment he had been anticipating. The second Naruto jumped in, driving both feet into its chest, causing it to fall onto its back as it stepped back to steady itself after he jumped up and landed an uppercut square on its jaw while ducking under a wild punch. With a kunai in each hand, the two Narutos pulled out their weapons and moved forward to deliver the final blow. However, the stranger who had been assisting them leapt over the creature's shoulders and landed on it just as the clone was about to deliver the fatal blow before striking the creature in the chest with open palm strikes instead of fists. He straddled its waist and reared it back. The creature let out a strained cry as its body went limp and its eyes rolled into the back of its head. The real Naruto watched in awe as the immobile creature that had attacked him began to fade away from existence, with tiny fireflies floating away from its body, as the cage Bunshin vanished and he walked away back to the group he had come with. He asked, "What just happened?" in the hopes that someone would explain what had happened to the monster, whose body had vanished as if it had never been there. Rather, a gun barrel was pressed up against his temple. "Okay, maybe I should say thanks first?" The man with the gun said. Fa Kruimd Gem Res. Naruto closed his eyes, knowing that the end was near, despite the fact that he didn't understand what had been said. "Who? Ra Luam Pa Uv Ika do I see?" He felt the gun's pressure release from his head, and when he opened his eye, he saw that the man had retreated, leaving his combat partner in front of him. As they faced each other, he chuckled uneasily. Thanks." A pair of white eyes without pupils were visible when the stranger reached up to their face and drew the goggles down around their neck. Surprised, he spluttered, "You're a girl." Given the way she moved so elegantly during the fight, how could he have thought she was a guy? When he realized he had expressed his surprise, he hit himself in the head and hoped she wouldn't understand him the way he couldn't understand them. She abruptly closed the distance, putting his arm around the blonde's shoulder as if to give him a hug. She pressed her palm firmly into his stomach after whispering, "Etud," into his ear. The wind knocked Naruto off his feet, taking him by surprise with his eyes watering and his vision blurry. He looked ahead and saw something move away from him. Two more blurs came toward him, and he heard someone yell. Then he was struck in the back of the head, and all he saw was black. He opened his eyes to find himself lying on the hard, cold ground once more, his face glowing in the light. He muttered that he didn't intend to develop the habit, then he slowly sat up and covered his eyes with his hand in the hopes of improving his vision. He saw four men standing with their backs to him, each with a gun ready as though they were on guard duty. He reached out to the nearest one in an attempt to pull himself up, but instead of falling forward and landing on his face where the man had been standing, he fell straight forward. He looked around again, cringing in pain as he picked himself up, and felt foolish when he realized that the man he had attempted to grab was actually only two men, and that his double vision was the cause. As they watched the teenager struggle to his feet once more, one of them yelled, "Seed!" Then, kicking him in the chest, he tumbled across the floor until his back struck something. He complained, "Hey, that hurts." He was about to get back up and face the man when the second guard pivoted on his heels and pointed his gun at his head. "Hu Sujek, Kud Ed?" In response, he raised his hands in surrender and said, "Whoa, okay." They said it was one message he could understand, even though he didn't know what it was. They would shoot him if he moved. He exhaled in relief as the two men eventually turned away from him after a few seconds. He looked around and discovered that his back had struck a barrio, preventing him from falling off the side. When he finally looked over the edge, he saw that he was on a ship with the anchor slowly lowered to keep it in place in the water below. With waves crashing against its side, there were barrels and crates all over the deck, a crane sitting idly at the stern, and spotlights on top of the bridge that were pointed at the water to break through the darkness. Then he heard a motor and turned to face the bridge, where he saw a hatch open and the girl he had met earlier emerge behind a man and approach him. The man stopped before him and threw something at Naruto, who caught it with one hand before examining it. A pair of goggles for swimming. The man pointed to the water and then moved his arms as if swimming, saying, Ku yht rom fedr dra simjika yht we lyhcdyo. What? Naruto turned to face him, perplexed. What was he saying when he said, "I don't understand what you're saying"? Did he want to swim with him? While one of the guards aimed his gun at his chest, threatening to shoot him for his impudence, the only response he received was a slap on the back of the head. Before anything more could happen, the girl yelled, "Fight!" and stepped forward until they were facing each other, which worried Naruto. She had struck him the last time she was this close to him hard. "He says you can stay if you work for us. You understand me?" the blonde asked, startled to hear her say something he truly understood. However, he was struck in the back of the head once more before he could finish speaking. Before putting on the goggles, he rubbed the sore spot on his head and begged them not to hit him again. All right, I'll work." The girl put on her own goggles and adjusted them until they fit her face comfortably. "We found some ancient ruins right beneath us that where we're heading." "Got it," she said. The blonde, Roger, laughed uneasily as he glanced around at everyone who was either waiting for him to get to work or for a chance to shoot him. Taking a deep breath and clearing his head, he ran towards the ship's railing, vaulted over it, corkscrewed in midair, and dove into the water below, hoping it would be the first option. The girl entered after him a short while later. As their bodies adjusted to the chilly sea, the girl swam up to the blonde and said, "It's not active right now, but there's a huge power generator down there. We're going to go and turn it on. That way we should then be able to salvage the big prize, okay?" Naruto nodded and followed his diving partner into the water, saying, "Got it." Naruto looked around, trying to see where he was going, as the two swam deeper into the abyss, following a cable that ran from the ship. He could only see the shadows of the few tiny fish that swam around him as they dove farther and deeper, though, which gave the area a spooky atmosphere. He halted his descent when he felt something brush against him. He turned around to look for whatever had touched him, but all he saw was darkness. He continued after the girl who had gone before him, thinking it had only been a small fish. Abruptly, the searchlights from the ship above pierced the darkness and moved across the water. Naruto stopped to look around as the light passed in front of him and became alarmed when he saw a fish bigger than himself. As the fish turned its tail and swam away, shocked by the strange creature it had seen, he panicked and clawed at the water to try to put as much distance between them as possible. He stopped and was grateful to see only a few small fish swimming around him after he thought he had sufficiently separated himself from the enormous fish. He watched the girl continue swimming in the distance, unfazed by the surroundings, as the searchlight continued its journey before coming to a stop on an ancient submerged structure. How could such a massive structure have been at the bottom of the sea? Naruto had seen the other sunken ruins from earlier, but they were only broken walls and statues. He swam swiftly to catch up to the girl after spotting her swim through a gap at the building's side. After passing through the opening, he entered a room with a big machine in the middle and computer consoles on either side. Before moving on to the next computer, the girl swam to one of the computers and began pressing various buttons in an attempt to get it to start without any luck. Naruto swam to the opposite side of the room and began searching for a way to switch the computer he was using while she fiddled with the computers. He began pressing random buttons in the hopes that something would happen after failing to locate a power switch. Eventually, he became frustrated and began beating his fists against the console. He kept hitting the hard metal with his fists until he managed to grab the power button, which activated the computer and caused all of the computers in the room to light up. The girl, who was unfazed by the sudden flashing lights, pushed him aside before he could celebrate his success and took his place at the console before beginning to type. Following a few minutes, a number of lights began to turn green before the big machine that had been sitting motionless in the center of the room burst into life, sending the entire space trembling. Naruto turned around and went back outside, where it appeared much brighter than it had once been, after surveying the once dark room now lit by all the tiny flashing lights, which reminded him of an arcade he used to play at as a child. With his head poking out the hole, he observed the lights along the building's side turning on one after the other, illuminating the surrounding area and scattering the tiny fish behind them. Naruto found himself floating above an entire city, carved out of the sides of the chasm they had been swimming down, as the lights continued to turn on, illuminating what had once been dark, murky water where you could only see a few feet ahead. As he followed the girl farther and farther into the sea's depths, he gazed around in wonder as they passed more buildings of all sizes and shapes. He was taken aback by the place's immense size and wondered if it had been sunk like the ruins he had discovered earlier or if everything had been constructed underwater. They eventually arrived at the ocean's bottom, where they were joined by other crew members who had swum down after the lights were turned on. They promptly set about securing the big cables they had brought with them to the ocean floor. He swam to the location where one of the cables had been connected in an attempt to better understand what they were doing. He began to remove the surrounding mud and dirt, exposing a faded pattern underneath, and was startled to hear the sound of metal reverberating through the water as he tapped the surface. This must have been the big prize that was mentioned, Naruto thought. He began swimming for the surface when the ground began to tremble, fearing an earthquake, but as he was climbing, someone caught him by the arm. In a panic, he turned to protect himself, but as the cables tightened and began to slowly drag the salvage up through the water, he saw the girl's face as she held him and pulled him away from the seabed by herself before the pale-eyed girl gave him the thumbs up and they both started back toward the surface. The two of them floated side by side in the water, watching it gradually rise. Naruto dragged himself back onto the ship's deck and followed the girl. He removed the goggles from his head and tossed them aside before shaking his head to dry his hair and sprinkling his wet splashes over the dry ones as the cabin hatch opens and the man from earlier steps out. The two men on deck complain about something while water splashes in their faces. "See you roughed ed ku tufach drana. Via." The girl smiled as she accepted the towel that was handed to her and drew her goggles down around her neck. Drana feicht y khdl dubik d noek du dane sa ybynd drek dessa. As he led the group back inside the ship, he questioned, "Fam dra udron krebisi fem pa rana dra sunhek du rom fedr dra simjika. See you frid fyc ed weave wait tufach drana?" Yankreb. As the door began to close behind him, Naruto heard the final guard ask, Yankreb? Roof tet fa sihika du vate uha druka? Naruto shouted, "Hey, what about me?" But it was too late because the hatch had already closed, leaving him outside in the chilly night, pounding his fists against it in an attempt to attract their attention. I helped too. To get someone's attention and let them know he was cold, he wanted to shout as loudly as he could. And hungry to death, however, that had failed the dozen times he had tried, so he resigned himself to sitting in the shadow of the ship's crane at the back, shielding himself from a passing shower with the tarpaulin that covered it. The lack of food caused his stomach to growl in protest given how many times he'd passed out. He had no idea how long it had been since he'd last eaten anything, which was before his blitzball match when Konoha had been attacked. With a slight smile on his face, he told himself, "I'm getting ramen when I get home. Pork, I'll have 2, not 3 big bowls of miso." He was so engrossed in his thoughts that he was unaware that he was being watched until he heard metal clanging against the floor in front of him. "Hell, I'll have both." He snapped out of his reverie to look at the source of the noise and saw a tray sitting in front of him, piled high with bread, rice, and meat. Then he heard a giggle, and as he looked up, drooling, he saw that the girl was staring down at him, unable to contain her laughter at the ridiculous face he was making. As he approached the food slowly and waited for her approval, he said, "For me?" She said, "Unless you're not hungry." But before he could respond, his stomach growled loudly for everyone to hear, and he swooped for the food disregarding the available utensils. He scooped the food into his hands and then put it in his mouth, stuffing more in before his first mouthful was done. Even though it wasn't the best food he had ever had, any food was better than none at this point. As he tore the bread in two with his teeth and attempted to swallow it without chewing, the girl screamed, "Hey, wait, slow down." He panicked when the bread became lodged in his throat. The girl rolled her eyes and then held out a canteen to the blonde, who swiftly snatched it from her, drank half of its contents, and cleared his throat while his face turned red and he choked and gasped for air. He leaned against the crane and took deep breaths, relieved to be able to breathe again. He then turned to face the girl who was standing in front of him, grinning as she took pleasure in the amusement he had been giving her. After taking a final bite and carefully chewing his food, he got up and approached the girl, giving her a close look. She had those eyes, short, thin, and tied up her dark brown hair. He was certain she was blind because of the peculiarity of her milky white eyes, which lacked pupils. However, she had been swimming in the sea and had assisted in battling the creature that had attacked him earlier, so that couldn't be the case. He would have found it odd if he hadn't already experienced so much, but after being attacked and washing up in an unidentified place, it wasn't high on his list of priorities. He asked the first question that sprang to mind after swallowing his mouthful. "Can you understand me? What's your name?" After the girl giggled behind her hand, Naruto put his arms around her waist, lifted her up, and spun her around. "Of course I understand you, and the name's Hanabi." He cheered in relief as she screamed, "Put me down," and struck him in the back with her tiny fists. When he finally began to feel lightheaded, he helped the girl stand up again and watched as she stumbled and fell while he straightened out. He assisted her in standing up and then leaned back against the railings to ask, "Why didn't you speak earlier?" Before leaping up to sit on the railing next to him, Hanabi brushed the dirt from her wetsuit. "Sorry about what happened earlier, it's just we thought we were a fiend." He asked, perplexed by the odd word she had used, "What's we?" "Oh sorry, We means you sometimes I use Hyuga words without realizing. Hyuga? Well, that answered one of his questions, but now he had another. He was beginning to get a headache from all the questions he had been asking since leaving home. She gestured to the ship and her clothing, as if they should have revealed them, and said, "Yay, we're Hyuga, can't you tell?" Before an idea struck her, she jumped off the rail and took a few steps back from the blonde as if she were about to flee, asking defensively, "Wait, you're not a Hyuga hater, are you?" He repeated, scratching his head thoughtfully, "A Hyuga hater? I've never even heard of a Hyuga before just now." She questioned doubtfully, "Never heard of us before? Who are you? Where are you from if you've never heard of us Hyuga?" He proudly puffed out his chest and said, "I'm Naruto, star player of the Konoha Spirals." However, instead of receiving the response he was expecting when people realized who he was, Hanabi simply appeared perplexed, as if he were a talking toad. She inquired, "Did you hit your head or something?" He rubbed the area of his head where they had struck him and said, You guys hit me." As Naruto nodded his head, Hanabi questioned, "You're from Konoha? Konoha was destroyed over 1,000 years ago?" With an expression of surprise and bewilderment, he yelled, "What? No, it can't be. That's my home, I was only there yesterday." She saw the anger in his eyes and begged him to calm down, saying, "Okay, calm down. Why don't you tell me what you remember?" Naruto told the young girl everything he knew about Konoha, including its life, Blitzball, and the Juubi of Sin's attack. While they were both gazing out to sea, he also described how he and Kakashi were engulfed in this light before becoming washed up in this strange land. He discovered that he was just speaking whatever was on his mind. Hanabi simply stood there, paying close attention to what he was saying the entire time. He asked aloud, "If Konoha was destroyed all those years ago, how'd I end up here?" He didn't think it was fair that his house had been destroyed so long ago. The blonde nodded in response. "You say you were attacked by the Juubi? Well, that's it then. You're probably just under the effect of its toxin." "What do you mean?" "The Juubi gives off this toxin that affects those who get too close to it but are lucky enough to survive." The Hyuga clarified. "It causes memory loss, making people forget who they are and those closest to them. Luckily, it's only temporary, so you should remember everything properly in a few days. Maybe you just had some sort of dream." He nodded his head and said, "Okay." He wasn't going to argue with her, but he wasn't experiencing memory loss or having trouble recalling a dream. He knew who he was. He was from Konoha and played Blitzball, was he not? "So you're saying I'm sick cause of this toxin? You sure?" "Yay, like I said, Konoha was destroyed by the Juubi over 1,000 years ago, so how could anyone play Blitzball there anymore?" He shook his head defiantly and whispered to himself, "It can't be. I saw that thing attack Konoha." "So you're a Blitzball player, right?" The girl with the white eyes went on. "You should go to Tanzaku. They're holding a big Blitzball tournament there. I'm sure someone there will recognize you there and they can take you home." He gave an enthusiastic response, "Yay. I guess." Hanabi began to bounce around him, but she didn't notice. She began walking toward the ship's bridge, but she stopped and turned around, saying, "Well, it's settled then. We'll get you there, so don't worry." She smiled broadly and said, "Or you can stay here with us if you want." Panicked, he said, No, I'm good." He was concerned that he would become the Hyuga's personal punching bag if he spent too much time on the ship with them. "Okay then," she said somewhat irritably, since she had finally made a non-Hyuga friend after years of trying, but he now wanted to go. "Oh, and one last thing, don't tell people you're from Konoha. It's something of a religious place to most people, so even if it is only the toxin talking, some people won't take it too kindly." As she spoke, Naruto had to suppress his laughter. The notion that his Konoha was a place of worship must have seemed absurd to him. He must have been in another planet. As she started to head back inside the ship, she said, "So it's decided then. I'll tell the guys to head to Tanzaku." Then she remembered something and ran back across the deck to him. She kicked him in the shin and said, "By the way, this is for thinking I was a guy." When his foot got caught in a rope and he fell to the ground, he swore in agony, clutched his leg with both hands, and hopped around the deck while yelling a few words that Hanabi had never heard before but was certain her father would never want her to repeat. But instead of the thump one might anticipate from someone toppling over, the ship rocked violently, knocking Hanabi off her feet and sending her and Naruto tumbling across the deck before colliding with the crane. Naruto stood back up and pulled Hanabi back up, asking, "What just happened?" The crew rushed outside to see what had happened when the ship's hatch opened, but they fell on top of one another. As soon as they did, the ship shook once more, as if it had been struck by something, and something black rose out of the water with a crash. Sin. Juubi. The Juubi began to rise out of the water as it slowly circled the ship, and the men screamed in fear. As everyone around him fled in fear, Naruto gazed around in wonder. He had only known Hanabi for a brief period of time, but after witnessing it destroy his house, he was convinced that the Juubi of Sin was a bringer of death. One of the Juubi's stories suddenly leapt out of the water and hit the ship's side, causing it to roll onto its side and nearly capsize. As a maelstrom began to form below them, Hanabi fell across the deck and caught herself on the railing, preventing herself from going into the water. In the meantime, Naruto clung to a loose cable from the crane and prayed that the ship would right itself before he fell. But as the ship trembled once more, moaning in agony as the enormous monster tossed it around, the cable came loose, and he fell a few feet while holding onto the end before it abruptly stopped, sending him plummeting further. He closed his eyes and waited for the sensation of the cold water to hit him, but instead he felt a hand grip his. He opened his eyes to find Hanabi clinging to him and frantically attempting to pull him back aboard. She let out a sigh of relief as she slowly drew him back until he could grasp the railing by himself. It was brief, though, as a number of crates broke free from their chains and fell all over the deck. Hanabi managed to avoid them, but Naruto was not so fortunate, taking a blow to the head and losing his hold. Time seemed to slow as he fell, seeing Hanabi's white eyes wide with fear as she reached out in a vain attempt to catch him before he hit the water and was sucked up by the watery vortex. Naruto woke up in the water. Face down, he raised his head out of the water, spluttering and choking as he struggled to catch his breath, splashing around in panic. After he eventually stopped breathing, he cleaned his eyes and began searching for Hanabi and her ship from which he had fallen. However, he was swimming in clear blue water with a clear, calm sky and a bright sun above him, rather than the black night sky and dark water of the previous night. He began turning in the water to locate the ship after figuring that he must have been unconscious for a few hours. He hoped that he hadn't gotten too far away for the Hyuga to discover them. However, he was unable to locate the ship anywhere he looked. In fact, aside from a speck of land off in the distance, he was unable to see anything nearby. Naruto began swimming in the direction of land after realizing that it wasn't a good idea to stay afloat in the water until a ship arrived to pick him up. He reflected on what he had learned from Hanabi the previous evening as he swam. His house was destroyed more than a millennium ago. Konoha? She couldn't have been correct, could she? Perhaps she had misled him, or perhaps she had mistaken Konoha for another location. He hoped she was okay and that he would find her on the ship moored up at the island he was swimming towards following the Juubi's attack. As Naruto continued to swim toward land, the warmth of the water gradually gave way to a chilly chill. He had forgotten how long he had been swimming, and by now he didn't care, preferring to concentrate on the island in front of him rather than the cold, his cramping body, and the constant growls from his ravenous stomach. He pushed his body farther and farther beyond its limit with each stroke, causing his arms to scream in agony. He had excellent endurance from all the years he had spent training for blitzball, but only for a half-hour game with a break. He now felt as though he was participating in a survival exercise because of everything he had been doing for the previous few days. He sighed with relief as he finally saw a yellow sand beach, and the idea of being dry and getting some much-needed rest kept him going. However, an invisible object struck him in the head, forcing him to stop sooner than he had anticipated. After righting himself, he thrashed around in the water and attempted to locate the sneak attack's origin. As he braced himself for another potential assault, he wondered if there were monsters in the sea like in the ruins. Hey, he glanced up. The beach he was going to was the source of the call. He managed to see a small group of people standing on the beach by squinting his eyes. Someone shouted again, attempting to get his attention by waving his arms. Hey, are you okay? Can you get us the ball? The ball? As Naruto looked around, he noticed a familiar blue blitzball floating next to him. Blitzball? Yes. He exclaimed. He had been left stranded in this strange foreign world, where everything seemed strange to him. Ever since the Juubi of Sin's attack, he felt hopeful when the blitzball, an object he recognized, appeared out of nowhere and he reached for it. Hey, he called back, signaling with his free arm that he had noticed them, then threw the ball above his head before plunging beneath the water. Then, as if firing from a cannon facing away from the ball, Naruto leapt out of the water as it began to descend. Naruto began to turn his body until he was upside down. As the two got closer, he then swung his leg, making contact with the ball and sending it back toward the beach before plunging back into the ocean. The ball soared just a few inches above the water, creating a wake that sliced through the soft waves before landing on land, passing the gathered onlookers, and disappearing into the trees behind it. Naruto swam in the direction of the beach after making the shot until he was able to stand up. He started to walk up the beach while a group of 5 men approached him, his legs aching from the long swim. There was a strange silence when they first met as the group examined him in awe, attempting to make sense of the young man dressed in black and orange. The blonde sheepishly said, hi. as he spiked his wet hair up and ran his hand through it, creating a tiny spray of water. However, he was immediately bombarded with inquiries. "That was awesome. What team do you play for? That was a fluke, there's no way you meant to do that." As they asked their questions, he watched in shock as they tried to talk over each other, getting louder and louder until he finally couldn't understand a word they were saying. He decided to ignore them and focus on his surroundings while they kept shouting over one another. Everyone in the group who were speaking to him was tanned from playing blitzball in the sun for so long. He found it odd that they were all wearing green tank tops and shorts with orange patterns. He hoped they were wearing a uniform because he didn't like what the place considered fashion, but it's possible they were a team practicing instead of just hanging out. A loud voice called out, "Hey, quieten down." This instantly silenced the group, which had devolved into a deafening rabble, and almost gave Naruto a heart attack. In the meantime, the group fell silent, allowing the sixth mana, whom he had not even realized was Tharia, to move through them and come to a halt just a few feet away from him. With his voice still loud, he held out a ball to Naruto, who was examining him, and asked, "Can you do that again?" He was dressed in the same colors as the other people on the beach and appeared to be around his own age, but instead of shorts and a tank top, he appeared to be wearing what he could only describe as a short-sleeved jumpsuit with the legs cut off. His arms were covered in white bandages from his hands to his elbows, and he wore a red sash around his waist that blew in the cool sea breeze. In addition, he looked as though he was wearing orange leg warmers despite the heat from the sun. However, that wasn't the most peculiar thing he had observed about the man. His dark black hair was styled as if someone had placed a bowl on top of his head and then cut around it, instead of being long and loose like the other people on the beach. Then his eyebrows appeared. They were bushy and thick when the man lifted one. He wondered if he had ever thought of plucking them to thin them out, giving the impression that a hairy caterpillar was crawling across his face. He realized then that he had been so preoccupied with staring at him that he had not answered his question and was still awaiting a response. Everyone shifted to give him more room as he nodded his head and caught the ball as it was thrown to him. He closed his eyes, inhaled deeply, and spun the ball on his finger while facing everyone. He needed a little blitzball to help release the tension that had been building up inside of him. He threw the ball over his head and away from him as his eyes opened. As the green-clad group looked on, speculating that perhaps he had slipped, one of them was going to go get the ball when two Narutos unexpectedly materialized in puffs of smoke. After catching the ball, the two clones began kicking it around and passing it back and forth between them at an ever-increasing speed before being kicked directly back in the direction of the original. Seeing the ball coming, he jumped and kicked it as he performed a backflip and skillfully landed back on his feet. As if he had eyes in the back of his head, the ball was launched back across the beach by the force of the kick, kicking up the sand along the way, before eventually making its way out to sea and toward the horizon. As the crowd watched in amazement at what they had just witnessed, one of the clones questioned, "So, what do you think?" Before flanking the original and then vanishing in the same manner, the young man with the bowl haircut finally spoke. As he bounced around with excitement, he yelled, "Your fires of youth must be burning like an inferno to be able to do that. You're certainly no amateur. I'm Rock Lee, team captain of the Takigakure Orochis. What about you? Are you freelance? Or do you have a team?" Naruto answered, ignoring his perplexing remarks about youth. As everyone fell silent, he proudly puffed out his chest and said, "No, I play for the Konoha Spirals." Unprepared for such a response, he turned to face the raucous group surrounding him, who had previously gazed at him with wonder but now looked at him with bewilderment, incredulity, and even rage. He didn't understand their confusion, so they asked him again, "Who did you say you played for?" The Konoha Whirlwinds were well known. Konoha was destroyed over 1,000 years ago. His mind replayed what Hanabi had said. Nobody would think he had come from a place of worship that had been destroyed a millennium ago. Hanabi said something. He sounded more like a question than a response when he said, "I was on a ship and was attacked by the Juubi?" But he never noticed because he was too worried about the potential beating that Hanabi claimed could occur for bringing up Konoha. "I got too close and my head's all foggy, so I don't know where I am or where I even came from." Rock Lee's fuzzy eyebrows shot up to his forehead as he asked, "You were attacked by the Juubi?" He took a step back, preparing to run and swim out to sea if they became violent, and answered, Yay." Lee went on, "And yet you're still alive." He abruptly straightened up, bending his head and holding his right hand in front of his face with two fingers pointing up at the sky. "Praise be to Jashin." The other Orochis instantly imitated their coach's behavior. Naruto lowered himself to sit in the sand, relieved that they would not attack him. As Lee sent the team back to training, he remarked, "You look exhausted. How long had you been swimming out there?" Before responding, Naruto gave his head a thoughtful scratch. I've no idea, I just woke up surrounded by water and swam for the first bit of land I saw. Before Lee could finish, he heard Naruto's stomach growl loudly. Well, Jashin must have been smiling down on you for... Lee started laughing, and the blonde gave him an uncomfortable smile. Naruto simply nodded as Lee took hold of his arm and dragged him to his feet, asking, "You're hungry, aren't you? Follow me, I'll take you back to the village and we'll get you something to eat." With his stomach still rumbling for food, Naruto silently followed Lee off the beach and into the forest. He watched the Aurochs continue to practice, passing balls back and forth as one of them attempted to mimic his shot but missed it, landing on the back of his head instead. He laughed to himself. He wouldn't be getting very good at that shot anytime soon because it had taken him months to perfect it in the hopes of becoming the greatest blitzball player of all time. He had practiced his passes and shots at the training ground for hours on end. Every day his teammates frequently urged him to make the place his home because he had spent so much time there training. At home he yelled, "Hey Lee!" and the young man in front of him stopped. Konoha was destroyed, wasn't it? 1,000 years ago? He had only recently met him, but he felt compelled to ask because he had a gut feeling he could trust him. Isn't the place now just rubble? Yes, Lee said, leaning against a tree and speaking much more quietly than before. All those years ago, the world was full of these big cities run by machines. People would just play around and have fun while they did all the work after that. Just take a look around you. As the blonde surveyed his surroundings, he became aware for the first time of the ancient, dilapidated building directly across the street from them. All of the Makina cities, including Konoha, were destroyed by the Juubi. As you mentioned, that was roughly a millennium ago. The Juubi is our penalty for allowing things to spiral out of control and for not making an effort to work hard for anything. As he ran his hand along one of the stone columns, Lee explained, "It's just so frustrating that we're the ones suffering because of what everyone did back then. Of course, the important thing is that we work hard and repent for our sins, and eventually we'll be forgiven." Hanabi and Lee couldn't both be lying, and why would they? It was exactly as Hanabi had said. Lee put his arm around Naruto's shoulders and laughed, "But you playing for the Konoha Spirals? That's hilarious. I'm not saying that they didn't exist, but I bet a team that lived in all that luxury wouldn't have been that tough," Lee said. When Naruto woke up after the attack, he thought that the Juubi had just taken him to some foreign land, that he could return home in a few days, but instead it had taken him into the future. This whole thing began with the Juubi, and perhaps if he could find it again, it would take him back home. Until then, he would just have to try to make the most of the situation. Naruto laughed. As the tropical birds soared overhead, the cool canopy kept them cool as they made their way inland from the beach. They followed the path up along the cliffside, where a number of small waterfalls cascaded down around them. From this vantage point, you could see the majority of the island, the verdant forest, the white sand beaches, and the crystal clear lake into which the waterfalls plunge. But Naruto didn't see much of this. What's the reason behind that? As he watched Lee, he asked inquisitively. Ever since they had entered the forest, he had been walking on his hands. Looking back at the blonde, he responded, "It's training. I walk down to the beach every day to exercise my legs, so I walk back to the village this way to give my arms the same workout." As he contemplated joining in, Lee pushed off the ground and leapt back to his feet. He wanted to laugh, but the idea seemed so foolish, and he looked foolish, but he had been walking in that manner for almost an hour and showed no signs of exhaustion. "Did you know, Naruto, that Tanzaku is hosting a major tournament?" "Yay, I've heard about it," he answered, recalling that Hanabi had told him about it on the ship prior to their attack. "Want to be a member of our team? Every Spira team participates in it prior to the season beginning," Lee inquired. "You can return to your former team after someone will recognize you among all those teams and supporters." As he considered the question, Naruto paused, and resting against a small wooden fence that prevented him from falling off the path, he gazed out across the island and said, "Sure, why not? Yes. With you on our team, our youth fires will burn brighter than ever," Lee exclaimed, jumping up and down with delight. Naruto concluded that the only similarities between Spira and Konoha were the Juubi of Sin and Blitzball while he watched Lee dance around. He was also not far away when they arrived at the summit of the cliff overlooking the tiny village in front of them. Lee proudly said, "Welcome to Tanzaku Village." "That's your house, then?" Naruto asked, surveying the area. A small stone shrine stood off the side of the road, and a tall wooden fence encircled the village. "Yes, 10 years ago, my sensei and I came here before he left me in charge 2 years ago. He was the coach for the Aurochs and trained me. We have been on the team for 10 years, and we have yet to win a game." Naruto gave him a startled glance and said, "You've never won a match?" The energy he had been speaking with had vanished when Lee answered, "Never. Last year was my big chance, but I got some news that distracted me and I couldn't concentrate. So our losing streak continued, Lee said. In an attempt to console the black-haired teenager, Naruto put his arm around his shoulder as he walked next to him. I've lost games, but it must have been difficult to never win. In order to concentrate on my new career, I resigned after the previous season. However, I can hear Guy-sensei's voice telling me that if I work hard enough, I can succeed every time I try. Naruto was certain that Lee was going to cry as he explained, so I just can't let go until I do. So you're hoping to win the competition? Have a spectacular farewell? I don't care about winning, Lee said, wiping the tears and perspiration from his face with one of his bandages. We can leave satisfied as long as we give it our all and demonstrate to everyone that hard work can lead to success. Are you serious? If you don't win, how can you demonstrate your success? The blonde inquired bewilderedly. When I ask, what's our goal, I want you to say victory rather than do our best. Which is victory? Do you really think we could pull it off? Obviously, what other way can you demonstrate your success? Gosh! Lee screamed and leapt to his feet, his eyes blazing with a fire Naruto had never seen before, which made him smile. Well, if it isn't the one from the sea. A pair of men who had followed the same path as Naruto and Lee approached them from behind. They were both wearing thick green combat vests and black pants, and their jet black hair was tied up in spiky ponytails. The only difference between them was that the taller man had 2 scars on the right side of his face and wore an animal skin coat over his vest, while the younger, shorter man wore a gray jacket with blue markings on the short sleeves. Keep an eye open, fiends have been reported in the area. The last thing he wanted was to repeat the battle with Hanabi, his friend, who had been a struggle, Naruto screamed in his mind. Before they proceeded into the village, the shorter one remarked, after surviving the Juubi, it'd be a drag if something happened to you now. Who were they? As he watched the two make their own way into the village, Naruto questioned. That was Shikaku and Shikamaru from Anbu. And what? Did you also forget that? Naruto simply lowered his head. Hey, don't worry about it, you can ask questions at the lodge when we get to the village. There, they have a lodge. Thank you, and don't be concerned, he smiled and said, we'll be taking the cup with us when we leave Tanzuku. Excellent. When he eventually stopped at the end of the road, Lee exclaimed, well, here we are, my friend, Takigakure village. So, is this the village? The village was small, with only a few small huts made of wood and canvas running along the outer wall, and at the far end stood a single stone building, a temple that towered above the village and looked out over the island. Naruto asked no one in particular as he passed through the gateway. Hi, come on. Naruto the blonde turned to face Lee after hearing the voice, but before he could ask him what he wanted, Lee took hold of his wrist and dragged him back behind the big log fence that surrounded the village. Do you remember the prayer? He said, releasing Naruto. I forgot to ask you. He had never been religious and had never believed in a god, so he didn't know any. He was about to tell Lee that, but then it hit him. There was one prayer that he didn't know. What kind of prayer was he supposed to remember? Before bowing his head and clapping his hands together, he said, yeah, I think so. Itadakimasu. Itadakimasu. Looking puzzled, Lee asked as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Naruto explained, it's what you say before you eat. At that point, he realized he was no longer in his own world. You have to imagine me holding chopsticks, he went on, feeling foolisher with each sentence. Lee covered his face with his hand and shook his head in shock, saying, that's not what I meant. The toxin has definitely affected you, hasn't it? Now watch me. This is the prayer. Suddenly he stood straight, his head bowed and his right hand held up vertically with 2 fingers pointing upwards. He held the pose of a few seconds as Naruto looked him over before relaxing and letting his hand fall to his side. Now you have a try. Before he finally looked at his right hand and slowly moved his fingers into the proper position, the blonde stood looking off into space, certain that he recognized the prayer and that he had performed it before. Once he was satisfied, he brought his hand up to his face and bowed his head. As he walked around the blonde to examine him, Lee said, not bad. He then paused to straighten his posture. But if I were you, I'd practice it a few more times. Children learn this as soon as they can walk. If you take too long, someone will assume you're having a problem, he said. After witnessing a giant creature attack on his home and being transported to a different time and place, Naruto simply stared at him. From his perspective, there were many issues, but it wasn't him. All right. Head for the Anbu Lodge and get something to eat. Just tell them I sent you and you'll be all right. Lee shouted, placing his arm across his shoulders and guiding him back through the gates into the center of the village where people were going about their daily lives. Before he could respond, Lee was running again, out of the village gate and back towards the beach. When you're done there, head for the temple. I'm sure you'll feel better there, he said, pointing first to the big tent to their left and then to the lone stone building. Right. I've got jobs I need to do, so I'll see you later. As the people around him watched the newcomer to their village with caution, Naruto walked to the tent Lee had pointed out to him, shaking his head in disbelief as he did so. When he arrived at the lodge, he pushed aside the curtain covering the doorway and entered a large room full of tables and benches, some clean, others covered in dirty bowls and glasses, and small lanterns hanging from the ceiling gave the room a warm glow that made the animal masks hanging on the walls appear frightening and dark. Across the back wall, next to the lodge's only other doorway, there was a bar manned by a woman with long brown hair who was stocking shelves, while two men sat on the other side of her, silently drinking. He approached the bar slowly after realizing that no one had yet noticed him. "Hello." In an attempt to attract the barmaid's attention, he said, "Lee sent me," but she didn't reply. "Ah, the one from the sea." Naruto turned to face the voice, but instead he caught the attention of two drinkers, whom he recognized as the ones he had met on the way to the village. "I'm Naruto, and this is Shikamaru, my son," the scarred man said, gesturing to the person beside him that said, "Shikaku." But his query was cut short when the bartender cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. "So how?" With a deep sigh, Shikaku said, "And this is my wife, Yoshino." After turning to face the three men, the woman smiled and said, "Good afternoon." She then spun around on her heels and resumed her job of stacking shelves. "Hi." He gave her a weak wave in return. She had seemed so pleasant and composed when she had spoken to him, but the two people next to him had acted as if she were a threat. "Why?" Shikaku finally spoke after a few moments during which the only sound in the room was the clinking of glass bottles against one another. "So you fell overboard, and no one saw you. How did you end up on our shores?" Following Hanabi and Lee's advice to mention Konoha, he explained, "Sort of. I was washed overboard when we were attacked by the Juubi. They had thought he was crazy, but at least they understood, and there was no assurance that anyone else would." "Sin attacked you close by?" Shikamaru asked, speaking for the first time as he started to fiddle with his fingers, his eyes closed as if in deep thought. "But it hasn't attacked yet. Why, I wonder?" He muttered, "This is troublesome." But before he could formulate his own query, a towel was flung in his face, taking him by surprise and sending him tumbling backwards from his stool. Using the bar to help him get back up, he saw his mother staring at him from the opposite side. Shikamaru ran to the back and returned a few moments later with a first aid kit in hand, quickly handing it over to Yoshino, who began cleaning and disinfecting his wound. "I don't care if it's troublesome. We have a guest and he's injured," she shouted, drawing everyone's attention, including Naruto's, to the blood-stained bandage on his arm. It had stopped hurting long ago, in fact, and it had started to go numb, but that was normal, he thought, as he began to panic. "We will need to increase patrols on the island because the Juubi may still be present." Shikaku filled his glass from the bottle next to him and drank it all at once before swiftly refilling it, muttering, "That's all the Anbu need." "What is Anbu? Are you unaware of the Anbu?" Before her husband could refill his glass, Yoshino snatched the bottle of alcohol from the bar and sprayed it on Naruto's arm. She then proceeded to disinfect the wound before sewing it up. "No, I don't remember much before the attack," he said, grinding his teeth together until the alcohol's stinging sensation went away. "Someone mentioned that a toxin of some kind was to blame." The scarred man looked into his still empty glass and said, "Yeah, the toxin has a habit of making people forget those closest to them. Fortunately, this is only a temporary effect. Tell him about the Anbu, Shikamaru, until it wears off. The protection of the Spira people is the ANBU's sworn duty," Shikamaru explained in a bored tone as he sat back on his stool, rested his head on the bar top, and closed his eyes, seemingly about to nod off. "We patrol routes and villages, protecting people from fiends and others who wish to do them harm, and provide assistance evacuating people when the Juubi attacks and help them to recover from the damage afterwards." "You don't fight the Juubi, so what?" "No." Shikaku shook his head and reached for the sake bottle, but Yoshino moved it out of his grasp. "We can only assist in containing the damage," Shikaku said. "A summoner is responsible for fighting the Juubi." "A what? Are you serious? You have no idea what a summoner is that typical?" Shikamaru questioned his dad. He turned to the blonde and patted him on the back after saying, "I could explain it to you, but I think it's a question best answered at the temple. It's not unusual to forget, but this does seem like a rather severe case." Before telling her family to stop being lazy and begin preparing meals for their guests, Yoshino remarked, "But first you'll eat." Naruto contemplated whether or not to enter the temple as he sat in the Anbu lodge eating while Yoshino told him various stories about the island, only pausing to refill his bowl or to give orders to her husband and son to do more work. He had mostly stayed silent, only asking her to elaborate when she talked about the blitzball team, figuring that the more he knew about the team, the better he could help them and Lee win the tournament. Yoshino was willing to assist, and she went into great detail about how awful they played it. The only time she could recall them ever winning a match was when she was younger, when he asked her to explain Jashin and summoners. However, she simply shook her head and told him that he would find those answers at the temple. So there he was, standing outside the temple under the large stone canopy as the sun slowly began to set. Finally ready to go in, he reached for the door when it suddenly opened and two small children came running out. Caught by surprise, Naruto stumbled backwards, before tripping and falling to the ground as the children ran past him, weaving in and out of the stone support columns before disappearing into one of the village's small tents. A few seconds later, a woman came running out the temple, asking where the children had gone. Still in shock after believing that there wouldn't have been any more surprises for him while he was in the village, just pointed in the direction they'd ran off in. The woman thanked him for his help and apologized for whatever her children may have done before running after them, leaving him to wonder what had just happened, before he finally started to laugh. With all the surprises that had happened in the last few days, this one he didn't mind. Seeing the two children playing reminded him that despite all of the horrible things he'd seen, there was still some good in the world, so with a smile on his face he got back to his feet and walked through the temple entrance. Inside he found himself inside a large circular room filled with people and the soothing sound of singing. As he slowly walked to the center of the room, he looked around. He found that while a few people were watching him, everyone else was facing the outer walls, laying flowers and lighting candles next to the small statues that decorated the walls, before kneeling down and praying. Assuming that they were praying to friends and family that had passed away, he tried looking away to give them some privacy, but no matter where he looked he only found more of the same. People praying, people crying, but no one singing. He realized he'd expected to see a choir performing on a stage, singing the calming song that filled the temple, but there was nothing. He started staring at the walls, trying to see if there was any speakers playing the music that he was staring to get the feeling that he'd heard before, when he suddenly bumped into something. Looking before him he found he'd walked into a large stone statue that stood just off to the right of the room alongside a second. The Y stood beside a large stone stairway at the head of the room, while a second pair of statues stood in the same place to the left of them, giving the room a sense of symmetry. As he looked over the statue of a man dressed in regal robes that looked over the room with a stern expression on his face, he noticed that it looked a lot newer than the other three statues, depicting more people also dressed in elaborate robes. As Naruto stood beside him to examine the statue, a bald man wearing vibrant robes grinned and said, "It's taken 10 years, but we were finally able to get ourselves a statue of High Summoner Hiyashi." A High Summoner? What is it? The scene was eerily similar to when he told the Blitzball team he came from Konoha after he washed up on the island, and Naruto looked around to see that everyone in the temple seemed to have heard what he'd said and were now staring at him in shock and disbelief. The toxin came because I was too close to the Juubi in the hopes that they would accept his story," he hurriedly said. I don't remember much." He found the excuse amusing, and it was also a little depressing. Fortunately, the people around him appeared to believe the story, as they all bowed and prayed for his health before carrying on with their previous activities, leaving him by himself with the man who had spoken to him initially. The man pointed to the 4 statues and explained, "Only a chosen few are able to call upon entities of great power. The summoners are practitioners of a sacred art, sworn to protect the people of Jashin. The eons they come to protect us when we are in need. After hearing our prayers, they're Jashin's blessing." Naruto simply nodded his head in agreement as the man spoke, concluding that the summoners were simply strong, distinguished men deserving of respect. The mattress was hard, the blankets were itchy, and the village was quiet and peaceful instead of the loud music and flashing lights that he was used to, so he supposed he should be thankful that he was finally able to get some sleep, even though the last few places he'd slept had been on a ship's deck and in the sea itself. Thinking that he wouldn't get any sleep, he threw his pillow across the room and struck another sleeping man in the face, hiding in fear and pulling the covers over his head in the hopes that no one had noticed him. But when he poked his head out, he breathed a sigh of relief as the man remained asleep, only moving so that he could claim the makeshift weapon and rest his head on it. Feeling safe, he sat up in his bed and reflected on what he'd learned that day. In an attempt to jog his memory, the priest told stories of the strong summoners and their eons, but it failed. He spoke proudly and went into great detail about how the people of Spira found hope in believing in Jashin. After more than an hour with the blonde, the priest finally gave up and suggested that he pray to Jashin, insisting that this would help. Feeling like an uninvited guest at a party, he found a quiet place away from the other temple attendees, closed his eyes, and tried to process what he had been told. After all, he thought it would be strange to pray to a god he didn't understand or believe in. Lee eventually returned and escorted him back to the Anbu tent, where a bed had been prepared for him to stay in, which he was more than happy to accept. Finally feeling calm enough to sleep, he reached over to the empty bed next to his and picked up the pillow. Yawning, he grinned to himself and lay back down, finding his new pillow much more comfortable, when he heard a voice from the bar across the doorway. "Why don't you go check on their well-being?" The voice, which sounded worried and like the priest who had spoken to him earlier, said. A second voice he recognized as Lee's said, "I can't, you know that." He spoke loudly and animatedly even in the middle of the night, when people were sleeping in the adjacent room. "But it's been over a day now, they'll be fine, besides," was the last thing Naruto heard before falling asleep. "Are you sure you're not giving up?" a woman asked, as she spoke to the man stood in the doorway to her house, as the cool breeze from outside blew in making her red hair whip about like an excited dog wagging its tail. "It's only been a day." "Obviously not. More people are joining the search as we speak," the man said, adjusting his mirrored glasses and pushing them back up his nose. She turned around and swiftly retrieved her jacket from the back of a chair before heading out of the house, but the man blocked her path. "Maybe I should go and look too," she said. "No, Kushina, you ought to remain here. He needs you now more than ever, so you stay here and take care of your son while we look for him." After attempting to reassure her, he turned around and hurried off to join the other search parties. "We'll let you know as soon as we find anything," he said. In the throngs of people who had gathered outside her house, many of whom had come to assist in the search and others to offer their condolences, as if Minato had been gone forever, she called out, "Thank you." She wished that people would just leave her alone because she didn't want to consider what her life would be like without him. "Mom, have they located him yet?" When Kushina turned to face the little, quiet voice, she saw her young son in his pajamas, holding a plush orange fox in one hand and rubbing his eyes drowsily with the other. "I apologize, Naruto, did I wake you up?" When he nodded his head drowsily, she asked, nervously teasing her hair. "No, they haven't found him yet, but don't worry, he'll be home soon," she said, putting on a false smile to hide her true anxiety from her son. The little boy reached up to his mother and said, "Mommy, you're crying." He ran a finger along her cheek and wiped away a tear that had fallen from her eye without realizing it at last. Giving in to her emotions, she took her son and gave him a tight hug, trying to find some kind of solace for herself as more and more tears fell down her cheek. When Naruto woke up from his first full night's sleep since the attack on Konoha, he felt completely rejuvenated. He untangled the sheets that were scattered everywhere and discovered that his clothes had been moved. Rather than the unkempt heap he had left them in at the foot of the bed, he found them cleaned and folded neatly on the nightstand next to him. With a note on top, he grabbed the note and read it with a chuckle, realizing that it was from Yoshino, who had stopped by while he was sleeping and had taken his unkempt clothes to be cleaned and repaired. The note also stated that if he wanted her to fix anything else in the future, she would charge him the next time and that she wasn't cheap. Putting the note aside, he picked up his clothes and took a moment to check them over before he started getting dressed. Yoshino had done a fantastic job cleaning them. They looked brand new, even the old ramen stain on the front of his jacket that had persisted no matter how many hours he spent cleaning it was gone, and all the rips and cuts had been neatly sewn up, which was much better than the patchwork repairs he was used to doing. Regardless of the cost, she seemed to be worth it. When Naruto was finally dressed, he went to the dining area and was pleased to see Yoshino, who was occupied serving food to patrons while her son slept with his head leaning against the bar top. She turned to Naruto after serving the final customer and smiled as she said, "Good morning, I hope you slept well." As he reflected on the nights he'd spent on the cold, damp, hard floors, he answered, "I did. It was a lot more comfortable than the last few places I've slept. And thanks for cleaning my clothes. You didn't have to do that." Shikamaru was startled when she grabbed a cloth and whipped him across the back of the head with it, saying, "It was nothing. You've been through a lot it seems after your encounter with the Juubi, so the least I could do was let you face the world in some clean clothes." He looked up at his mother, exhausted, and was about to say something, but was met with her stern gaze. He sighed deeply, pulled himself off his stool, and began gathering the empty dishes on the tables. "Are you aware of Lee's location? I need to see him about doing some training if I'm going to play with the Orochis," Naruto said, attempting to contain his laughter as he watched the scene play out. The young man had been literally whipped by his mother. "Yes, Lee did mention that you would be joining the team." As she started to clean the bar, Yoshino noticed that the blonde's eyebrows were furrowed, probably trying to imagine the overly excited man he had met the day before being even more so. "He'll probably be on the beach with the rest of the team, but I'd check at the temple first. He might still be there checking on things," Yoshino said. He seemed rather excited, more than usual. "He must think you something special." As he walked out of the tent, he said, somewhat deflated, "Oh, thanks." The temple was the last place he wanted to be. The day before, when the monk had tried to tell him everything about Jashin, he had felt totally out of place there, and he was relieved that the man had given up because all he was getting from him was a headache. He turned to face the village gates and the path that led to the beach. With a heavy sigh, he turned around and walked back across the village square until he was looking up at the temple's stone doors once more. As much as he didn't want to go inside, he didn't fancy the long walk to the beach only to have to come back again. If Lee wasn't there, she said he'd probably be on the beach, he thought to himself as he began to make his way towards the long winding path before stopping at the gates to look back at the temple. He entered, bracing himself for more of the odd stares he had been receiving since coming to this strange world. Perhaps if he was fast, he could leave before anyone could question him. Fortunately, he didn't have to search long because he discovered Lee standing in the middle of the room, conversing with the monk. "At least you could enter and look," pointing to the doorway at the top of the stairway, the monk begged. "Is there a problem?" Taken aback by the blonde's unexpected appearance, Lee and the monk swiftly spun around to confront him. "We don't know," as the monk left them, irritated that he couldn't convince him to agree with him. Lee clarified, "Well, technically they're an apprentice summoner, but their spirit burns so strongly I'm sure it won't be long now. The summoner hasn't returned yet." Naruto nodded his head and said, "Okay." He didn't know what he was talking about, but he wasn't particularly in the mood for another lecture about summoners and Jashin like the one from the day before. Lee, on the other hand, was able to tell right away that he didn't understand and began to explain, saying, "The apprentice summoner prays beyond the cloister of trails. Remember that the apprentice becomes a full-fledged summoner if the prayer is heard in an attempt to refresh his memory," he said. "There is someone inside, and they haven't returned yet. Is it really that risky?" Lee looked back across to the monk, who simply stared back at him. "Yes, it can be sometime, and they've been gone for a whole day. It don't usually take that long, which is why people are starting to worry," he said. "Perhaps we ought to enter and see how they're doing." In agreement with what he had overheard the monk say to Lee upon entering the temple, Naruto proposed. Lee, however, shook his head, saying, "There are already guardians in there, and besides it'd be forbidden. However, they might be in danger." As he hurried up the stairs and pushed the door open, he responded angrily he could never stand by and do nothing when someone needed assistance, and it irritated him even more when those who could provide it refused to do so. "Cease. You can't enter," the monk shouted, seeing him walk through the door, his voice attracting the attention of everyone who had been praying, and causing them to gasp in shock and cry out in outrage at seeing someone go against the teachings they held so dear. "The precepts must be obeyed." He shouted back, "Like I care," just before the door shut. As Naruto turned another corner and discovered a wall obstructing his path, he muttered to himself, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. With a frustrated sigh, he pivoted and made his way back the way he had come. He had been anticipating flames shooting out of the walls or monsters lurking around every corner, ready to leap at him. When Lee warned that the place could be dangerous instead, he was trapped in a stone labyrinth with odd glowing symbols flashing on the walls. When he reached the final point, where the path split, he thought, "There's no wonder this summoner has been gone so long. I bet he's still trying to find his way out of this place." He then tried the opposite path. Mazes were something he detested. They brought to mind the time he spent 5 hours lost in a hedge maze in Konoha, and it was only after he gave up and fled through the walls that he managed to find his way out. Someone would have to come and find him if that was any indication of how long he was going to be stuck there if they weren't as scared to break the rules as he was. That is 64, 65, 66, 67 inches. When he heard the counting, Naruto stopped dead in his tracks. The only sound he had heard that wasn't his own footsteps since entering the cloister of trials was the strange music that had been playing in the temple's main room. Was it a timer? Was the maze a race? Or was it a countdown to something dangerous? He proceeded cautiously and quickly through the maze, following the sound of the counting to see what it was, and what he discovered left him feeling both relieved and perplexed. He was relieved to find a large door at the end of the path that was different from the one he had entered. He was eager to get out and had no plans to return to a place like this ever again. He was perplexed, however, when he discovered Lee, dressed in green, performing press-ups in front of the door. "What time did you arrive?" After completing the count, Lee looked up at the blonde and grinned broadly before getting to his feet. 99, 100 inches. "Naruto, you finally made it. I knew the fires of youth inside you would help guide you here." He laughed in embarrassment and said, Actually it was more like the sound of your counting, but seriously I came in here before you. How long have you been waiting there?" "About 10 minutes, and you thought you'd do 100 push-ups while you waited?" He responded, much to Naruto's surprise. "Well, I'd already done 200 sit-ups." Was he boasting because no one could show that he couldn't accomplish all of that in 10 minutes? Lee pushed the heavy door open and beckoned for him to follow before he had a chance to consider his options. He followed his example and entered the doorway, entering a small circular room with Lee standing in the middle. He stood next to Lee, letting the door close behind him, and glanced around the room. The door and window they had entered were the only ones present. He turned to Lee and was about to inquire as to whether there might be a secret door they needed to enter when the ground shook and there was a rumble. A moment later, as they stood on it, the ground began to abruptly begin to descend after trembling once more. Naruto initially thought that the ground had collapsed, but he soon collected himself after realizing that he was not going to die but rather would be riding in an elevator like he was back home, and that Lee had not responded to anything by now. He reasoned, he ought to be accustomed to surprises. As he watched the carvings in the stone walls surrounding him pass him by as they went deeper underground, Naruto finally found the right words to break the silence that had descended between them. "So I thought you said only summoners and their guardians were allowed in here. So won't you get into trouble too when we get out of here?" Lee said, "No," with a seemingly carefree demeanor. He looked back at Lee and waited for a response before asking, "So what makes you so special then? Is it the reason your hair's like that?" He was joking. Unaware that the blonde had been kidding, Lee responded solemnly, "No, I have my hair like this in honor of my master. I'm allowed here because I'm a guardian too." Was Lee a guardian? He believed that because summoners were so significant, their guardians would appear more menacing, enormous, muscular men with bulky weapons and heavy armor, not as if like Lee, actually. The platform eventually stopped in a room with only one door at the far end, so he headed for it, Lee at his heels. "I'm excited to present you to the others. I have no doubt that you'll get along like kids." "Why is that?" "Well, how could your youthful fires not burn so brightly?" As he arrived at the door, Lee said, "One is a beautiful blossoming flower who wouldn't hurt a fly. One is as loyal as a hound, and the other—" He started to explain, but was cut off when a large white dog jumped on him and pinned him to the ground. Naruto saw the attack and quickly reached into his back pouch to retrieve a kunai, and he was about to tackle the dog when he noticed something odd. Instead of screams of pain and panic at being mauled by a horse-sized dog, Lee was laughing. His face was being licked by the dog. "All right, Akamaru." Lee chuckled and gave the dog a hug before attempting to push it away so he could stand up. "It's good to see you too." When Naruto attempted to follow him in, Akamaru quickly leapt in front of him, bared his teeth, and growled at him, making him fear for his own safety. With one last lick, Akamaru crawled off of Lee, enabling him to stand and enter the room correctly. "Who is this guy, Lee?" As he walked alongside Akamaru, a young man with red markings on his face asked, inspecting the blonde while running his hand through the dog's fur. He was dressed in black pants and an open jacket that revealed the light armor plates strapped to him underneath. "Why are you in this place?" a female voice called out, drawing Lee and Naruto's attention. Lee waved to the pink-haired girl leaning against the distant wall and said, "We just came to make sure you were alright, Sakura. People were starting to get worried." "What the heck? Were you afraid we wouldn't be able to do the job?" Sakura scowled as she pushed herself off the wall and strode across the room, her long pink dress trailing behind her, to stab him in the chest. While he had been intimidated by Akamaru and the other guy, Sakura was making him seriously rethink his decision to enter the sacred chamber. Was she the beautiful flower that wouldn't hurt a fly, as Lee had mentioned? Because the way she was clenching her gloved fists suggested that someone was going to get hurt, and he really didn't want to be that someone. Naruto tried to explain, "Sorry, it's kind of my fault." As she turned her green eyes towards him in an attempt to divert her attention, he asked. As she rolled her fist back and threw it at his head, causing him to dive between the guardians to defend himself, she said sternly, "You're not supposed to be here." He quickly rolled to his feet and turned back to Sakura, ready to defend himself, only to see her being restrained by Lee, who was struggling to hold her back, while the other guy just giggled at them. "Lee, let go of me or you're next," she yelled. But before he could answer, the room shook and a wall at the top of some steps began to rise up, revealing a doorway and making everyone stop what they were doing and look in that direction. The dust kicked up in the air as the wall rose to the ceiling, and then Naruto watched for what seemed like an eternity before the dust cloud began to disperse and the figure of a young woman appeared, wearing a purple dress, white top, and yellow obi around her waist. She began tentatively making her way into the room, wiping the perspiration from her forehead as her long dark blue hair and kimono sleeves flowed behind her with each step, before kicking a stone that caused her to stumble and fall. The guardians were left stunned as Naruto leapt up the stairs and rapidly dove at the girl, catching her and wrapping his arms around her, holding her close as they tumbled down the hard stone steps, using his own body to protect her as he hit the ground at the bottom of the steps hard. Everyone gathered around him worried about both of their well-beings. After the fall, everyone quickly forgot about their fight and rushed towards her to help her when they saw her about to fall down the steps. "How are you?" When Lee noticed blood leaking from the back of the blonde's head, he inquired in concern. He looked down at the girl he was holding in his arms and saw that she was staring back at him with milky lavender eyes and a flushed face. "I'm fine." He moaned and shook his head, not caring about his own bleeding as he attempted to remove the cobwebs. "Are you hurt?" He was initially concerned that she had been hurt in the fall because she kept staring back at him while her face grew redder and redder. Eventually, a tiny smile came on her face and she spoke in a shy, quiet voice. "I've succeeded. I've turned into a summoner."
So that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to the channel for more awesome stories like this. Thank you. See you all in my next video.